The city of Seoul never slept. Among its gleaming skyscrapers and bustling avenues, the Kang Group stood out as an empire of power and prestige. At the top of this conglomerate was Kang Ji-ho, a CEO known for his ruthless demeanor and obsessive dedication to business. To him, emotions were distractions, and his life was meticulously planned for success. However, fate, always unpredictable, was about to challenge his convictions. On the other side of the city, Ha Eun-ji adjusted her simple blouse and grabbed her worn-out bag. As a temporary employee at the Kang Group, her routine was exhausting, but she never complained. She desperately needed the job to help her sick mother and pay off overdue bills. Despite her fatigue, she maintained a strong spirit and a silent hope that one day her life would change. The first encounter between Ji-ho and Eun-ji happened in an unexpected way. That morning, the CEO was leaving a tense meeting, distracted by the upcoming billion-dollar contract, when he turned a corner in the hallway too quickly. At the same time, Eun-ji was also hurrying by, carrying a stack of documents in her arms. The collision was inevitable. Papers flew into the air, scattering confidential reports across the building's gleaming floor. A heavy silence followed. Eun-ji felt her heart stop when she realized who stood before her. Ji-ho, with his imposing presence and sharp gaze, looked anything but pleased with the situation. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly irritated. "Do you always walk around without looking where you're going?" His deep voice shattered the silence. Eun-ji blinked rapidly, her body frozen between fear and embarrassment. Feeling her face heat up, she immediately crouched down to pick up the documents. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kang. I didn't see." Her voice faltered, and she cursed herself for it. Ji-ho watched her for a moment. Normally, he would have completely ignored this kind of incident, but something about her made him hesitate. Maybe it was her eyes not just filled with fear, but also with determination. Or perhaps it was the fact that, for the first time in years, someone made him feel disconnected from the absolute control he exercised over his own life. With a short sigh, he crouched down and began picking up the documents alongside her. The gesture surprised Eun-ji, who never expected a man like him to lower himself to help a mere employee. "Be more careful next time," Ji-ho said, handing her the last of the papers. Eun-ji nodded, swallowing hard. Before she could thank him, he had already stood up and walked away with his impeccable posture. But as he strode down the hall, Ji-ho noticed something strange for the first time in a long while. His mind wasn't solely focused on numbers and strategies. The image of that woman lingered, defying his relentless logic. The following days were a challenge for Ji-ho. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get Ha Eun-ji out of his mind. His life had always been organized like a precise equation: work, success, and discipline. But now, an unexpected variable threatened his absolute control. Eun-ji, on the other hand, did everything she could to avoid further encounters with Ji-ho. After the document incident, she felt vulnerable under the watchful eyes of her colleagues, who hadn't missed the chance to comment on the fact that the CEO himself had helped her pick up scattered papers. The last thing she needed was to draw attention to herself. However, fate seemed to have other plans. On a rainy morning, Eun-ji was called to deliver documents directly to Ji-ho's office. Her heart pounded as she approached the frosted glass door. She took a deep breath and knocked before stepping inside. Ji-ho stood by the panoramic window, holding a cup of coffee. When he heard the door open, he turned, his gaze locking onto her. "Mr. Kang, here are the reports you requested," she said, keeping her voice steady. He walked to his desk, taking the documents from her hands. The brief touch sent a subtle shiver through Eun-ji, but she remained still, waiting for his permission to leave. Ji-ho took longer than necessary to review the papers. He couldn't explain why he felt the need to prolong the moment. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with a tension he wasn't used to feeling. "How long have you been working here?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. Eun-ji blinked a few times before responding. "Almost a year, sir." Ji-ho nodded but said nothing more. He realized he was interested in details about an employee that had never mattered to him before. This was dangerous. "You may go." His voice returned to its cold, professional tone. Eun-ji gave a quick bow and left the room, unaware that Ji-ho continued watching her until the door closed. However, Their encounters would not end there. Fate seemed determined to intertwine their paths, and with each new meeting, a forbidden attraction grew, one neither of them dared to admit. The atmosphere inside Kang Group began to change. Employees noticed something different about the CEO Ji-ho. Once impenetrable and distant, seemed distracted. He asked unusual questions, appeared in departments he had never visited before, and his attention, even if subtle, lingered on Ha Eun-ji more than it should. Rumors started circulating through the hallways. Subtle glances, casual encounters, and silences filled with tension did not go unnoticed. Some employees whispered that Eun-ji was trying to seduce Ji-ho to climb the corporate ladder, while others simply watched, curious to see how far things would go. Eun-ji, on the other hand, tried to remain indifferent to it all. She avoided direct encounters, focused on her work, and made a point of blending in with the other assistants to avoid drawing more attention. But it was impossible to ignore the way her heart raced whenever she ran into Ji-ho in the corridor, or when their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. The situation escalated to a new level when Eun-ji was summoned to accompany Ji-ho to an important corporate event. The CEO always relied on his personal secretary for such occasions, but suddenly, the responsibility fell on Eun-ji. She tried to refuse, claiming she was not qualified for the role. But Ji-ho's response was brief and definitive. "If I am asking, it means you are qualified." His tone left no room for argument. On the night of the event, Eun-ji wore a simple yet elegant dress, feeling out of place in such a luxurious setting. Ji-ho, standing beside her, looked as impeccable as ever, but there was something different in his gaze when it landed on her. "You are well dressed," he said, quickly looking away. Eun-ji blinked in surprise. Was that a compliment? Coming from the ruthless Kang Ji-ho? She simply whispered a quiet thank you, unsure of how to react. The evening seemed to be going well until a powerful investor approached Ji-ho, a sly smile on his lips. "Mr. Kang, I hear you have been paying special attention to one of your employees." The casual tone barely concealed the malice behind his words. Eun-ji froze, her face burning with embarrassment. Ji-ho remained composed, but his expression turned cold as ice. "My employees are competent. If I pay attention, it is because I value good professionals." His voice was sharp, a clear warning that the conversation should not continue. But the damage had already been done. The next day, the rumors spread even further, and this time, they reached the ears of the Kang family. Ji-ho's mother called immediately, her voice filled with disapproval. "I hope these rumors are false, Ji-ho. You know what your duty to this family is." He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his responsibilities colliding with something he had never allowed before: genuine desire. He knew he was in danger, but for the first time, he did not want to run. Chapter 4: The Weight of Choices. The tension within Kang Group had reached its peak. The rumor about Ji-ho and Eun-ji's supposed closeness was no longer just a hallway whisper. It had reached the board of directors. The shareholders, always concerned about the company's image, began questioning the CEO's behavior. But the biggest obstacle lay within his own home. That night, Ji-ho was summoned to a family dinner at the Kang residence. The setting was luxurious but cold. His father, Kang Dae-hyun, sat at the head of the table, while his mother, Han Soo-jin, maintained her impassive expression. The dinner passed in cutting silence until Dae-hyun's deep voice filled the space. "Do you have any idea what you're doing, Ji-ho?" he asked bluntly. Ji-ho set down his utensils and met his father's gaze, already knowing where this was headed. "If you're referring to Ha Eun-ji, yes, I know exactly what I'm doing." The matriarch of the family let out a heavy sigh. "An employee, Ji-ho? This is unacceptable. You have a legacy to protect. Your marriage must be a strategic alliance, not a choice driven by fleeting emotions." Ji-ho did not waver. "I have always done everything for the good of Kang Group. I sacrificed my personal life, my freedom, everything to follow this path. But this time, I won't give up on what I want." His father slammed his hand on the table, his expression filled with restrained fury. "Then are you willing to lose everything? If you continue with this stubbornness, you will no longer be the successor of Kang Group." Ji-ho felt the weight of those words. His entire life had been dedicated to proving himself worthy of that position. But now, he stood before a decision that could change everything. Meanwhile, Eun-ji was facing her own torment. At the office, hostility toward her grew by the day. Her immediate superior called her into a meeting and, with a sharp glare, tossed an envelope onto the desk. "You're being transferred to the Busan branch. Effective immediately." Eun-ji's heart stopped for a moment. They were trying to push her away. Her presence beside Ji-ho had become an inconvenience to the company. That night, she wandered aimlessly through the illuminated streets of Seoul, feeling powerless against the forces working against her. But before she could make a decision, a familiar voice called out, "Eun-ji." She turned and saw Ji-ho standing there, breathless. His eyes, always so controlled, were now filled with something she had never seen before: desperation. "Don't accept the transfer." He stepped closer. "Don't let them decide for us." Eun-ji felt tears well up in her eyes. "Ji-ho, I don't want to be a burden to you." He took her hands firmly. "You have never been a burden. But I need to know, do you still want to stay by my side?" In that moment, Eun-ji knew she had a choice to make too. Chapter 5. The Return and the Fight for Love. The rain drummed softly against the windows of Ji-ho's apartment as he watched the city from above. His empire, his position, his family, everything seemed insignificant in the face of the possibility of losing Ha Eun-ji. Since the conversation with his parents and their decision to push her out of the company, he knew he had to act. That night, Ji-ho called for an emergency meeting with the Kang Group Board of Directors. He arrived with his usual commanding presence, but this time, something was different. His eyes no longer held only the usual calculated coldness. There was a spark of defiance. "I am aware of the recent decision to transfer an employee to the Busan branch." His voice echoed through the boardroom. "And I know that decision was made for reasons that have nothing to do with her professional performance." The directors exchanged glances. The chairman of the board, an older man with graying hair and a stern expression, cleared his throat. "Ji-ho, you must understand that certain relationships compromise the company's image. We need to keep Kang Group's reputation untarnished." Ji-ho crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, a cold smile forming on his lips. "The company's reputation will not be tainted by who I choose to be with. If necessary, I'll put my position on the line." A murmur swept through the room. No one expected Kang Ji-ho, the heir to the Dynasty, to threaten to walk away from everything for a woman. But Ji-ho was not bluffing. The meeting was heated, but in the end, the board understood they couldn't afford to lose a leader like him. Eun-ji's transfer request was revoked. Meanwhile, Eun-ji had already made up her mind she was leaving the company. She was packing her things when she heard a knock on the door of her small apartment. When she opened it, she found Ji-ho, drenched from the rain, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "You're not going to Busan," he announced, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "I fought for you, Eun-ji. Now I need to know if you're willing to fight for us too." Her eyes filled with tears. Going through all these hardships had made her doubt whether this love was even possible. But seeing Ji-ho standing before her, ready to face everything and everyone, she knew she was ready too. She took a step forward and held his hand. "I never wanted anything else, Ji-ho." For the first time in a long while, he smiled, feeling that he was exactly where he was meant to be. But there was still one last battle to fight this family. Chapter 6. The Happy Ending. The final confrontation took place at the Kang mansion. Ji-ho had scheduled a meeting with his parents, determined to end this battle once and for all. When he arrived, he found his mother sitting with the same rigid posture as always, while his father maintained his severe expression. "I'm going to marry Ha Eun-ji." The words came out firm, without hesitation, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The room fell into silence for a long moment. Ji-ho's mother let out a deep sigh, bringing her teacup to her lips before responding. "Are you really willing to risk your entire legacy for a woman?" Her voice was controlled, but there was a hint of disbelief. Ji-ho held his gaze steady on his mother. "I am willing to build a new legacy if necessary, but I will not give up my happiness." Ji-ho's father scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're being foolish, Ji-ho. Love doesn't sustain an empire. But without love, an empire becomes a burden." Ji-ho replied, his voice filled with emotion. This time, his father didn't argue. There was something different about Ji-ho. It wasn't just rebellion or impulsiveness, it was genuine determination. After a long silence, his mother set her teacup down on the table and looked directly at him. "If this is what you want, then so be it. But I hope you won't regret it, Ji-ho." For the first time, she didn't impose an order or a threat. Ji-ho knew that, for his mother, this was silent acceptance. Days later, Ji-ho and Eun-ji were married in an intimate ceremony, far from the spotlight and the pressures of high society. She wore a simple dress, but to him, it was the most breathtaking sight he had ever seen. As she walked toward him at the altar, Ji-ho felt, for the first time, truly free. "Are you sure about this?" Eun-ji whispered, her smile filled with emotion. Ji-ho held her hands firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The wedding was followed by a new chapter in their lives. Ji-ho remained at the helm of Kang Group, but now on his own terms. Eun-ji found her place within the company, recognized for her competence and dedication. Years later, a small pair of feet ran across the garden of their home. Ji-ho sat on the veranda, watching his child play as Eun-ji approached, holding a cup of tea. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his smile. Ji-ho looked at her, and then at the child running through the yard. "I finally understand what happiness is." Eun-ji smiled and sat beside him. Ji-ho took her hand and squeezed it gently, feeling the absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. And so, against all odds, the billionaire CEO found something far more valuable than power and wealth: true love and a home forever. The end. Or rather, a new beginning.